So I want to talk a little bit today about something that has been on my mind in thinking about the whole issue of child abuse in the Mormon Church. And what I'd like to do is, for those of you that are kind of my age and generation, kind of bring your mind back to the mid-'80s and the show Saturday Night Live. There was an episode of the show Saturday Night Live where a young Irish ingenue singer, Sinead O'Connor, was invited to perform. And she came, and in the course of the rehearsals, she was going to perform a protest song by Bob Marley. And in the rehearsals, everything went just the way it was supposed to go. And then she, in the live broadcast, at the end of the song, she changed her performance, and she held up a picture of the Pope, and she said, "Fight the real evil," and ripped it up on national television. And if you can search in YouTube and find that episode, and you could hear the stunned silence in the audience. It was just amazing to see somebody take so bold an action against such a revered figure on national television. It was the impact of that was tremendous. And she did a number of interviews after that. And what she said was that she was trying to bring awareness to the issue of child sexual abuse and child abuse in general that happens within the Catholic Church that is being covered up by the leaders of the Catholic Church. And even though she was saying this in these interviews, nobody listened to her and believed her and took her at her word. And she even made subtle references to the fact that she herself was a victim of that abuse, and that is why she was so outspoken about it, and that's why she essentially put her career on the line in order to make that statement. Now, the reaction that happened from that took a number of forms. So the next week on Saturday Night Live, Joe Pesci was the guest. And in his opening monologue, he made some reference to the fact that that had happened the week before, and he held up the photo of the Pope that had been taped back together, and he said, "I fixed it." And then he kind of reverted to his kind of typecast character of the tough guy, mafiosa type person. And he said, "Boy, if that had been my episode of the show, I would have given her such a smack." And he made light and kind of joked about affecting violence on her for calling out the issue of sexual abuse and the cover-up, because her main point was that it was being covered up by the religious authorities. And this was in the early 80s. Now, what else happened? Well, there was a big spectacle of a bunch of conservative religious people taking all of Sinead O'Connor's records and cassette tapes and putting them in the street and using a steamroller to crush them. And you can see this if you search online, where they say, if she's going to rip up a picture of the Pope, we're going to crush all of her music. Because people were more concerned about the provocative nature of her protest than about what she was actually protesting. And they had revered their religious figure so much that they couldn't imagine that anyone would sully their good name with accusations like that. And the world went on. She never achieved the degree of acclaim and popularity after that event that she probably would have been entitled to because of the nature of her talent. If you go back and listen to her early stuff, she is a phenomenal voice and a phenomenal singer. And the odd thing is, knowing how things eventually turned out, she still held very closely to her religious convictions as a Christian and as somebody who believed in the divine. Now, so that happened in the mid-'80s, and fast forward to, almost 25, 30 years later, when the actual nature of abuse within the Catholic Church was discovered. And if any of you out there have not seen the movie Spotlight, I highly recommend that you go and see it, because it does such a powerful job of showing not only the nature of the abuse, the type of cover-up, but how the legal system becomes inculcated in perpetuating abuse. And that's what I want to talk about really today. Because when you go back and you think about what Sinead O'Connor did, if we as the public had listened to her, if we had said, wait a second, there's a problem, let's listen to these stories and believe them and really root this out, then how many more victims could have been avoided? You know, if the public exposure had happened so that people demanded change like they did once the Spotlight event happened for the Catholic Church, then all of the victims that have happened since then may have been saved that type of trauma. And so I think as a public, people who condemned Sinead O'Connor back then should have some serious introspection about the consequences of that type of action. But let's think about this more, because when you examine the nature of what happened in the Catholic Church, one of the things that was breathtaking was the scope of the cover-up and how the cover-up happened. And I've done some work collecting as many documentaries as I can about the Catholic Church sexual abuse cover-up, and there's some very heartbreaking stories. One of them is a BBC documentary about the abuse that happened in Ireland and the way that that was covered up. And in one instance, there was a priest who had abused multiple children, and the way that it became known to the church authorities is that one of the children came forward with allegations of abuse against a trusted priest. And so the church sent an investigative team to go and interview the boy. And in the course of that interview, he described all of the abuse that happened and said, there were other boys with me. Here's their name. Here's their addresses. You can go and talk to them about it. And at the end of that meeting, the investigating priest got the boy to sign a document swearing that he would never speak to anyone else ever about that abuse. And when you're a young child and somebody who is even higher than your priest or your bishop comes from the authority that speaks for God and swears you to that level of secrecy, you feel the weight of God on that oath that you've taken. And so I think we can't really blame this person for not speaking up about it until they found the courage and the bravery and the situation right years later. Now that particular cover-up and that non-disclosure agreement was signed and sealed on a religious threat, on the notion that you've sworn something to God and that if you break it, that you'll somehow be violating a covenant to God. After the Spotlight event, and once the sexual abuse cover-up cases happen, because you have to remember that this isn't just about priests abusing children. That's one evil thing, one terrible, horrible thing that's happened. But the religious authority covering up that abuse and silencing the victims so that they can't speak out about the truth of the abuse is as heinous, because it allows perpetrators to continue to abuse. It allows policies and procedures which place vulnerable children in the pathway of predators to continue. And so it is culpable in the abuse that takes place when you silence victims, because people don't know the scope or the nature of the problem. So while that particular silence was done under a divine covenant, what we saw after the Spotlight moment happened is that the church was compelled to disclose its financial settlements regarding abuse that had happened for years. And one of the most breathtaking things, I think, if I was a Catholic, that I would have discovered is that the Catholic Church had paid out billions of dollars every year for the past something like 20 years to settle cases of abuse with people who came forward saying that this priest, this person, or this religious figure abused me. And because it was able to dip into its deep coffers and pay for the silence of victims, then parishioners, Catholics going every Sunday had no idea how big, how pervasive, how widespread the problem was. And because they didn't know that the problem was that big, they didn't demand that changes be made at the institutional level in order to prevent those problems. They didn't know that they needed to stop priests being one-on-one with children or talking about sexual issues such as masturbation or pornography. They didn't know that those were things that were used to groom people for abuse, because it had been using the coffers of the church, the finances of the church, to cover up the scope of the problem. Now, I'm standing in front of Curtin McConkie, which is the law office of the church. Now, I say the law office of the church, what I mean is that they are the firm that the church employs to do most of its litigation. Now, depending on where any individual case is, it may use a different firm. And you know, they got a pretty nice spot here on City Creek Center. There's some interesting history that goes into Curtin McConkie that may be worth a different podcast in the future. One of those instances is that it may be that a son of a certain religious authority in the church was granted partnership in this firm, and very, very shortly thereafter they became the official firm of the church. Another thing is that this law firm used to be called Curtin McConkie and Pullman, and the reason that Pullman is not there anymore is very interesting and has some relevance to what we're seeing in the Joseph L. Bishop case, because when Pullman, who was caught in a sexual indiscretion while he was a stake president, relieved of his position as stake president and subsequently lost his position in the law firm, Elder Boyd K. Packer came to the stake conference where that was done and made some statements about how we in the church are a family and we keep our secrets private from the world so that we don't sully the family name. And that sentiment, I think, is reflected in how we see the legal arm of the church being used, specifically in the case of sexual abuse scandals. So I've been collecting what newspaper articles that I can, and I'm going to post them shortly, about settlements that have made it into the papers. Now, you have to understand how this works. Okay, so for every settlement that actually makes it into the papers, where you'll see, church settles case in sexual abuse for $3 million. Or you'll see, like was recently done, is the church settles a case, and we don't know the terms of the settlement because it's bound under a non-disclosure agreement. For every case that actually makes it into the paper, the only reason that the journalists knew to put it in the paper was that it had somehow entered the court system. Now let's step back and look at how that tip of the iceberg actually plays out in the way these things happen, because what we're seeing in the Joseph L. Bishop scandal is symptomatic of that. And that is that you'll have somebody who is a victim and survivor of abuse, who finally and ultimately, for whatever reason, wants to come forward. Now, keep in mind, if you look at the research on victims of sexual abuse, men and women, men in particular, the time from when the abuse happens to when they finally feel comfortable talking out about it can be decades. And this is something that's totally known, and it's part of why the statute of limitations has been extended or eliminated in instances of child sexual abuse. And that is because the people who are traumatized by these abuses don't come forward. They feel that they won't be believed. They'll feel threatened by the culture that's protecting people in the positions of power that feel unable to do these abuses. And so it may be decades before somebody comes out and says, this happened to me. This person who was supposed to look out for me, who was supposed to be protective of me, who was in a position of authority, abused me. And when they finally do, they may feel impotent. They may feel like nobody's going to listen to them. There's no recourse. They may be informed that, the statute of limitations is already gone. And so there's really, I can't even hold the perpetrator accountable. What can I do? And they may have loved ones who say, well, go talk to an attorney. They can at least, approach and find a settlement, something to find some measure of restitution for what you went through. And so they'll find an attorney, they'll contact an attorney, they'll say, this happened to me. In the event that they have evidence, which most of the times they won't have evidence, they'll put together a case. And what they'll do is the attorney will contact the attorneys for the church, or whatever the contact point is for the church. Now, this is all done totally privately. No journalist, no anybody has any idea about it. And so then the attorney will make the case out. My client was abused by such and such on these dates. These are the facts of the matter. And that's the first salvo. And then what will happen is the church will then do its investigation. Now, what is the purpose of its investigation? Is the purpose of the church's investigation at that point to really hold people accountable, or is it to assess liability? And I think that's one of the things, if you were a corporation, then of course you're just going to assess liability. But if you're a church that actually is supposed to be looking out for the well-being of your congregation, then you have a higher standard, or you should have a higher standard. And so when the accusation is made, what the group will sometimes do is they're going to figure out, well, how would this case play out if we went to court? How would a jury sympathize with the victim or not believe the victim? And as part of that investigation, then they may go and try to dig up dirt on the person who's accusing them. And so I think that's what we're seeing in the Joseph L. Bishop case, is that the church then went and found as much dirt as it could on the woman in the recording who was accusing the church leader, because if they could come back and say, look, this person has no credibility because look at their criminal record, look at, and we're seeing that their ecclesiastical file was also included in this. And if the details come out, we'll know more about that. But what that is likely to mean is that the documents, anytime there's a church disciplinary hearing, a court of love or anything like that, then after it's all done, the leaders write up a report of it and send it up to Salt Lake City. And that is now on their files. And so if they can go and pull that and use it to push back against a victim that's come forward and privately contacted the church, then they can try to minimize the chance that it would go to court, because the attorneys of the victims are going to say, well, if we went to court, the chance that we would actually prevail is very, very low, and it would involve a lot of cost, and you don't have the money, and I don't have the money, so what are we going to do? I have to get paid. This is what the attorney is going to say. And so then the settlement is something that becomes the victim's, the survivor's best option. And so depending on how strong of a case, then the church will scale the amount of money that they can send and offer to the victim. And that money may have when we heard about the 2010 second victim that came forward, the church said we offered her, counseling and therapy services. So what we know from other cases and things that have come out is what the church does. They say, we'll provide any mental health services. They can go see LDS Family Services or whatever. We'll pay for that. And here's some money. And that money is the hush money. Okay, and so if the victim, knowing that they really don't have any other legal recourse, the only thing they have is this settlement and what the church can offer them, many times they'll accept it. And I don't think any of us can judge them for doing that. They're trying to take the trauma that's happened in their life and just find as amenable a way of moving forward as they can. But the condition of accepting that money is that they can no longer talk out about it. They can no longer speak to it. And so when cases like that happen, a victim comes forward, contacts an attorney, there's an exchange, a back and forth that involves digging up dirt on the victim, seeing how much of a liability, how it would look in court, how it would look in the public sphere, and then money is offered, and they settle, and it gets closed. No court has ever been notified that this has happened. Nobody knows that this happened except for the victim and the attorneys involved. And that then goes away, and we have no idea that abuse took place. And one of the questions that in researching this I've always had is, when that happens and the church knows that somebody in leadership has been accused of abuse and is therefore a risk factor because at least one person has come forward accusing of abuse, and the church has acknowledged that a majority of the accusations that come forward are true and should be believed, okay? We've always wondered, when that happens, do they then, even though there was a settlement, did they go back and say, okay, this person is a risk. We don't want them in any positions where they might have exposure to children, any positions where they could exploit that power again, because these predators generally don't go, when they're young, they're predators, and then they grow out of it and they never, prey upon other people. As long as they are uncovered and they know they can operate in secrecy and exploit the power that they have over the vulnerable, that's going to take place. It's always a risk factor. So we ask ourselves, does the church actually then take them out of the position? And the thing that we are seeing with the Joseph L. Bishop scandal is the answer is no. They do not flag that member and prevent them from being in positions of authority, power, and exposure to vulnerable people. They just let all of this be silent and quiet and hope that it never comes out. And so when we think about how financial settlements can perpetuate abuse, the reason that they do is because it shields the rest of us from knowing who the abuser is. It shields the rest of us from knowing the scope of the abuse. A lot of us have been wondering, if Joseph L. Bishop had abused multiple women, why do we not see more victims coming forward and saying, me too? This second victim in 2010, how come we don't know about her? Why isn't she coming forward? Well, if she's already settled with the church, she is under a non-disclosure agreement and she cannot come forward, or else she will get sued by the church. And so those non-disclosure agreements, when you have one victim or one perpetrator, one predator, then if for some reason somebody comes forward, the rest of we don't know how many other victims that they have because of these non-disclosure agreements. So it actually silences other victims, so we don't know how widespread one predator's trail of victims are. And we don't understand the scope of the problem. Beyond that, as a church, we don't know how many of the brethren in positions of authority and power have a record of preying upon vulnerable people. We don't know how many of the people just in our local ward may be predators. If the church, whenever it finds any liability, pays people to be silent, then abuse is perpetuated because we have no idea. And what I am hoping that we're going to see at some point in the future is an accounting, because we talk about how the church doesn't share its financial information, and so, it's not financially transparent. We want to know where our tithing money goes. We want to know how much tithing money went into building the City Creek Center. I don't really care. The thing that I want to know is how many millions of dollars are paid out to silence victims to protect the good name of the church. Because I think when Catholics found out that billions of dollars were being spent every year to hush up the rotten heart of the church in every city around the world, I think they felt intense betrayal. And I can tell you that if the settlements that we see in the newspapers are the tip of the iceberg, and that there are hundreds of settlements that never even reach the courts that are out there that constitute a large chunk of the church's ledger in those, financial disclosures, because we, over there, the general conference is happening and somebody's going to stand up and say, we did an independent internal audit of the finances of the church and everything is in work, everything is done according to sound financial practices. Well, guess what? They could be paying out billions of dollars in settlements, and that would be considered sound financial practices, but it is completely unethical because it silences victims and it perpetuates abuse because we don't understand the scope of the problem. These settlements are also a way to reduce the exposure that the church has in the media to the way that it operates. And there's one case in Arizona that I think is very informative of that. I've referenced it before on other videos, but it's an instance where there was a man who was discovered to be a sexual predator, a pedophile, and he had confessed the nature of his abuses to church leaders at one point, and that the fact that he was a predator was not disclosed to the ward member. He was continued to be given endorsements to be babysitters and doing other things to other ward members, and ended up abusing other ward members. And so when the case came against this man, again, he wasn't a church leader, but the church was culpable because it had knowledge of his nature as a predator, and it had not warned people. And it had not done anything to make sure that he stayed out of access to other children. And maybe there's other details that would have come forward, but we don't know, because when the attorneys in the case called the bishop and the stake president to be witnesses, the church said, no, we are not going to allow them to testify on the stand. Now, if they had testified on the stand, then what would have happened is that the church's policies and procedures would have gone on trial. And there would have been liability that the institution itself would have had. And so the church fought this very strongly, and it went to the Supreme Court of Arizona, and the Supreme Court ruled that the ecclesiastical privilege that the church was trying to use to prevent their leaders from testifying actually was no longer valid, because the perpetrator had also confessed to police. So he had already opened up that confidentiality. And so then the attorneys come back and they say, okay, the Supreme Court has ruled you have to testify, so we're going to schedule the bishop and the stake president are going to testify. And so it was only at that point then that the church entered into settlement, and the case did not proceed because the church paid out a large sum of money in order to make the case go away. And so in that instance, the financial settlement was not used to silence people, it was used to make sure that the policies and procedures of the church did not undergo legal inspection, so that there were no public consequences of it. Because if you can imagine that something like that happened and they were forced to experience the legal consequences of their policies and procedures, well, then there would have probably been a big call for some of those things to change, just as the Catholic Church did. Once their internal machinations were made public, then the public's like, that's not acceptable. It has to change. And finally, with public pressure, they were forced to change. So when we're thinking about strategies to protect people from abuse, we can talk about, we want the door open. We want no one-on-one interviews that may be used for grooming. We can talk about how there should be no sexual explicit interrogation of our kids. That should be considered, and taught as a violation. So that, where's the Sunday school manual where it says if anyone, even a church leader, asks you these sexual questions, you need to tell an adult, because that's highly inappropriate. So in addition to talking about all those things, we also need to have a conversation where an institution that is actually concerned about victims and preventing abuse and has a zero tolerance for abuse should also have a zero tolerance for non-disclosure agreements in financial settlements. Now, financial settlements should still happen because there should be consequences when abuses happen. but there should be no non-disclosure agreement. Now, a lot of people may say, oh, well, you can't do that. That's just the way corporations work. That's just the way law works. Well, if you go, and I've spent some time as being part of the Protect LDS Children movement of looking at other religious denominations and how they handle sex abuse. And you'll find that some of them, as part of their response to the awareness that we have about the issue of sexual abuse, have encoded into their policy, we will never require a non-disclosure agreement as part of a settlement. And that's institutional policy. They don't say they're never going to, award financial compensation to people that come forward, but what they do say is that we will never tie that to silencing the victim. And I think that type of awareness of the nature of how those confidentiality agreements perpetuate abuse is something very admirable. Because I think, we're never going to get rid of the fact that there are predators. And so what we have to do is just make sure that our policies and procedures actually reflect the level of concern that the church has. When it says that it's an ethical organization, it has zero tolerance for abuse, it should also have zero tolerance for the type of corporate machinations that shield itself from accountability. Because accountability for a church or an organization like this is a wonderful thing, because it allows us as the public, as members, as stakeholders in the church, to know where the problems are and to make sure that they get addressed. And I think if we saw the scope of the problem, if we saw how much money was being paid out to settle sexual abuse cases, then maybe we would have a different type of movement that says that the importance of financial transparency beyond fraud, waste, and abuse, beyond nepotism, beyond anything like that, is so that we can see how much money we're using to silence victims of sexual abuse, which has the effect of protecting the perpetrators and facilitating more abuse. Curtin McConkie, the real seat of power. I really tried to get them to march to the church office building and then just march here afterwards, because there's an office, there's somewhere in there, there's a computer database that has a whole lot of information about all of the settlements that have happened. And I think with Joseph L. Bishop, we were just fortunate enough to get a peek behind the scenes of what happens. Because if they had gone to a settlement, it would have been swept under the rug. We never would have known about it. We would have continued to buy Joseph L. Bishop's books. We would continue to revere him as a respected man of God. And we would have no idea that when we send our youth at the cusp of adulthood to the missionary training center, that they still need to be vigilant for abuse. So that's it. Anyway, I hope you guys have a good conference weekend.